Are we ready? Yes. All right. Well, I'm Cinde Warmington. I'm happy to be with you here tonight. And we talked about doing a forum on voting. And I have to admit, I did not have to look very far to find an expert on voting who was willing to support me. As many of you know, Bill Christie is my husband, and we are in two separate rooms, but in the same house. And he talks about voting rights almost every day. And many of those days, he is talking to the infamous Paul Twomey. Bill is also a partner at Shaheen Gordon and an attorney, and does a lot of voting rights work, and is also counsel to the New Hampshire Democratic Party. Paul Twomey, the infamous Paul Twomey, has long been an advocate for voting rights, and is also an attorney, and is very active right now in the voting rights litigation that's ongoing. So we're gonna start out. I am Cinde Warmington, running for the District 2 Executive Council seat. And just I don't need to tell you all, many of you know, I have 40 years of healthcare experience, 20 years as a healthcare attorney, 20 years before that in healthcare, mostly laboratory medicine. And I also chair the New Hampshire Democratic Party's platform committee. And one of the reasons I wanted to talk about voting rights is just to make the connection for people about how the Executive Council is important to protecting voting rights. And that is, the Executive Council actually has to approve all judicial nominations made by the governor. And those judicial nominations at all levels of our courts make the kinds of decisions that we're seeing right now play out. And we want to make sure that we have judges at every level of our courts that will protect our voting rights. So the Executive Council plays a critical role in this process. And I would be, as your Executive Counselor, a fierce advocate for voting rights. So I am going to start this out and turn this over to Bill. Why don't you go ahead and get started? And we're gonna talk first about absentee voting.
Sure.
I'm sorry. Why don't we start with an update on? You want to start with an update on 1264 and SB3?
Sure. We'll do a brief update on that. Good evening, everyone. It's great to see everyone here on the call. So many friends and people that I know from politics and from the community. So it's great to see everyone. People ask these questions all the time. What's going on with voting rights litigation in the state? And there's, do a very brief update tonight. There's two cases. One, the SB3 litigation. SB3 was a statute that was passed several years ago that made the voter registration process long, cumbersome, confusing. And that law was challenged in court. Paul was part of that case, along with me and several other lawyers. And an order came out in early April from Judge Anderson in the Superior Court, finding that that SB3 was unconstitutional. The state has appealed that decision to the New Hampshire Supreme Court. But with the time it takes for appeals, that we're hopeful that means that SB3, that voter suppression law, we're hopeful that law will not be in effect for the election in September, for the primary for sure, and most likely for the general election in November. As it currently stands, SB3 has been declared unconstitutional. There's another bill, HB 1264, that was passed while the Republicans still controlled the legislature. That changed the definition of residency, and to make, the hope was it would make the definition of residency the same as the definition of domicile. In New Hampshire, you have to be domiciled to register to vote. And the hope, the intent behind that bill was to basically anyone, but focused on college students who registered to vote by declaring their domicile, but also become residents and meaning that they would have to obtain New Hampshire driver's licenses, vehicle registrations. We got an opinion from the New Hampshire Supreme Court in that case yesterday that basically said the state was right in its interpretation of that law, that college students who declare their domicile here are declaring their residency here. But there's some complexities of that decision that are still under review. And so that's up in the air a little bit right now. I think you're still on mute, Cindy.
Thank you, Bill. So the reason I put myself on mute is because I realized Bill's in the next room and you might be able to hear both of us at the same time. So I also wanted to let everybody know that doesn't know, we wanted to talk a little bit about the Secretary of State's Committee on the Emergency Election Support. So these are the funds that through the CARES Act that the state will be receiving to $3.2 million to address the COVID-related issues related to our election. And the issues that need to be addressed are being discussed by a committee that has been put together by the Secretary of State. So Paul, did you want to fill us in a little bit on that?
Sure. Basically most of the money that comes in through the CARES Act is undesignated. There are certain small portions that were designated, and $3.2 million was designated for election help given the emergency. There are other monies available. There's $60 million sitting in a HAVA fund in the Secretary of State's accounts that could be used to enhance election procedures for the fall. And there's really nothing that stops the other $1.25 billion in CARES money from parts of that being used. So to the extent anybody has any influence on the process or can talk to the legislators, it's going to take more than $3.2 million to make these elections work in the fall. There's just such tremendous challenges. The commission was picked by the Secretary of State, and there was a good deal of criticism about the lack of diversity. And people tend to, when they pick commissions, tend to pick people that sort of look like them and talk like them and think like them, and that's sort of what happened in this commission. But I've got to say the commission has taken their charge very seriously. They've worked very hard. They've heard from, invited in pretty much every interest group you could think of, anybody interested in elections, and they seem to be taking it seriously and understand the gravity of the situation. So I'm somewhat hopeful of where they're going to come out. They meet every day, well, not every day, they meet several times a week. I think they've had 10 meetings so far. They were meeting this afternoon. I'm not sure that they're not still going on right now. If you go to the Secretary of State's website, towards the bottom of the page, there's a link to the committee, and you can look and see all the documents that they've had. All of their minutes are online. There's videos of every single meeting they've had up online. So all the materials there. They're doing a very thorough job. They've got a report out by June 2nd, and it's not totally clear what they're going to report out. I'll tell you what I think they're going to do. I think they're going to make certain recommendations for the use of the funds. I think they may well make some recommendations for changes in laws, for things that just can't be done under our current law that we've now got a need to do. But that's not entirely clear. Today, I'm told that they voted against sending the ballots out in ballot applications, registration applications out in prepaid envelopes, allowing people to return them in prepaid envelopes, I should say. That's disturbing because there's very clear evidence from other states that you get a tremendous boost in the turnout if you allow people to send them back without having to get stamps. And getting stamps now means going to a post office, and that's again a danger point. And a lot of people are not able to get there. So I think to the extent anybody can reach out to their representatives, that's something that may have to be dealt with in legislation. I could go through the people on it, but it's basically there's Brad Cook's the chair. He's the chair of the Ballot Law Commission. he's very interested in fair elections. I mean, he's a very good friend of Secretary Gardner, but he's not afraid at times to go against him. So we've got Tom Sherman from the Senate and Kate Hanna, who used to be the legal counsel for John Lynch. Those are the two people I would consider Democrats. The Secretary of State says there's a third Democrat, but it's a person that's gone back and forth between parties in different elections, so I'm not quite sure what that status is. All in all, though, I've got to say I've been impressed with the amount of work they put in and the fact that they're taking this seriously. So I think some good things will come out of there, but perhaps not everything that we would want, but some positive steps.
Okay. So far, what we've seen is from the Secretary of State, there was a letter on April 10th that discussed absentee voting. And we know that there was further discussion about absentee registration that was in some guidance that was given in this more recent letter to the supervisors of the checklist. So if we could sort of go through have a discussion about what absentee voting and absentee registration is going to look like. And then we're going to turn and focus in on what in-person elections might look like in the fall. And what are all the issues? And I know you all have questions about that. So we intend to leave plenty of time for questions tonight, but there are just a ton of questions about in-person voting. So I wonder, Bill, if you could start with absentee voting. You're on mute.
All right, there we go. So in early April, early to mid-April, the Secretary of State's office and the Attorney General's office issued a guidance letter regarding absentee voting for the fall, both the primary election and the general election. And they have subsequently stated that the rules set forth in that letter will be in effect for the fall elections, regardless of the state of the COVID pandemic in the fall, that these are going to be the rules for the election. There's a really good summary of this if you're talking to other people, or if you want to look at it yourself on the New Hampshire Democratic Party's website. If you get on the website, there's like a banner on there. If you click on vote, it comes up. There's a one-pager up there about absentee voting. There's some frequently asked questions on there as well as other information about tracking your ballot and things of that nature. So just for future reference, for anyone on this call, or if you're talking to anyone about that, I strongly encourage you to direct people to that website. But to summarize, for this election, the question of who can vote absentee. Anyone who is concerned about COVID-19 can vote absentee in the fall elections. That doesn't mean you have to have COVID-19, or anyone in your household has to have COVID-19. Anyone with a concern that they could be exposed or that they could expose someone to COVID-19 can vote absentee. And how they got there was the Secretary of State has determined that the concerns about COVID-19 qualify as a disability under the existing absentee ballot statute. You can vote absentee in this state even before COVID-19 if you suffered from some sort of disability which made it difficult for you to get to the polls. And the Secretary of State looked at that provision and expanded that to include anyone with concerns about COVID-19. There's been some confusion about that in certain circles about, do I need to am I have some sort of indicia of disability or some sort of certification? And the answer to those questions is no. Your reasonable concern about COVID-19 is enough for you or for anyone to check that disability box and vote absentee in the fall elections. You don't need documentation. You don't need a doctor's note. It's up to you to determine if you're concerned about COVID-19. So because of that, we anticipate that there will be a significant uptick in absentee ballots or absentee voting in both the primary election and the fall election, to the extent where I think we need to plan for the fact that most likely the majority of ballots in this election will be cast absentee. So because of the logistics involved in that, we strongly encourage people, and will strongly encourage people, to request their absentee ballots early. It's best to do it about at least 45 days prior to the election. The way the form is, the request form is written, you can request an absentee ballot for both the primary and the general election. But anyone who does that, we're going to strongly encourage people to track the status of their ballots to make sure that, that request doesn't get lost in the shuffle at clerk's offices as this process unfolds, because there may be an issue as this develops. The clerk's offices are going to be asked to process many, many more absentee ballots than they ordinarily would. It's also going to be very important for you to get your absentee ballot in early because we have to rely in many cases on the mails in order to get your absentee ballot back to the polling place. There is a law that's currently in effect in the state that an absentee ballot needs to be received by 5 p.m. on election day for it to be counted. Now, in the 2018 election, a little under 3% of all absentee ballots were not counted, and about a third of those ballots were not counted because they were received too late. So if we factor in, there's going to be a lot more absentee ballots in this election, and there's going to be a bigger crunch on the mail system, a bigger crunch on election workers. It's going to be very important to get absentee ballots in early. Now, I don't want to alarm people on that, and but I do think we need to plan for that, and hopefully that is something that some of the state's money will be used to help ameliorate that issue, that there'll be more resources in place in order for people to vote absentee and to process the absentee ballots. So, that is basically the process for voting absentee in this election. You can also vote absentee if there's an employment issue, or you're not going to be in town the day of the election, or there's a religious issue why you can't vote on the day of the election. And we also need to remember that the polling places will be open on the day of the election, even if we go for a system that's going to be primarily absentee voting, that people will still be able to vote at the polling places on election day. And we'll talk about some of the logistics involved in that in a little bit. And it's also important to remember that you can vote absentee at your clerk's office before the election. And so if you're concerned about the crush of people at the polls on election day, you still can go to the clerk's office and vote absentee before the election. And we're hopeful that there'll be other measures put in place to facilitate people voting absentee before the election as well.
Let me just add one thing to that, Bill. The way you vote absentee before the election is actually to do the whole process and give them the application, bring it into them, then stand there and tell them you want to vote then. Normally they would say, do you want us to send it to you? Do you want to vote now? And so what you should do, what I would do and what I actually have done for the last 20 years is vote right then and there. In terms of following your ballot, there is a method on the Secretary of State's website to follow your ballot to make sure it's counted. It's sort of clunky and many times after the fact. There is an effort now to get a statewide portal up so that people can easily track their ballots. There's a U.S. Post Office program where they basically have a way to track ballots and see where they are and see if they're lost. There are efforts to try to get the state to buy into that. That's one of the things this committee is looking at, but it's probably something else the legislature should think about when they convene.
And one of the important issues about being able to vote absentee and request an absentee ballot is you have to be registered, right? And so the whole issue of absentee registration, then how do we do that? And maybe you could talk a little bit about that, Paul.
Okay, I'll start off by talking about what registration is like in New Hampshire before we had this crisis, because it's unusual it's different from just about any other state. There's 3 places you can register in person in New Hampshire. You can go to your clerk's office. You can go to one of the very few meetings of the supervisors of the checklist, who are really the people that do the registering, or you can show up at the polls. Now, we have same-day registration in New Hampshire due to the fact that when the motor voter law came along in 1993, the powers that were then in power in New Hampshire did not want to have motor voter. They didn't want third parties doing voter registration drives. They didn't want people to be able to register at motor vehicles. They didn't want people to be able to register other state agencies that they come in contact. So they traded it off for same-day registration. Many of them lived to regret that trade. But it ended up in a situation where we have same-day registration, but we have very few other easy ways to vote, to register. We don't have any online registration, for example. So it ends up that in New Hampshire, a huge amount of the vote registrations have taken place at the polls. And that causes all sorts of problems, capacity problems, but this year it causes a real nightmare because they're simply not going to be able to go through the amount of people. The stresses already on the system are going to be very, very difficult. And so something has to be done to ease up the absentee registration. I said there were 3 ways to do it in person. There always has been a way to register absentee. Someone told me the other day that their clerk in a very big community in New Hampshire had never heard of absentee registration because nobody had ever tried it. The reason nobody ever tried it is because it's a nightmare. It is far, far, far more difficult than it is to register in person. You have to, in person, if you don't have certain documents, you can sign the affidavits and register to vote, a qualified voter, an affidavit, a domicile affidavit. For the absentee registrations, you actually have to have the documents. And that creates all sorts of problems. And when you're trying to do this from home now, you may not have the documents there, and you don't want to go out under a stay-home order and expose yourself trying to get the documents from public places. Even if you have them at home, you may not have a copy machine or a way to send them. So the Secretary of State came out with a series of fixes for the short term. And by the short term, there's this required meeting of the supervisors of the checklist on June 2nd. They have to do certain things. They have to process all the applications they've had in. So he came out with some suggestions for now till June 2nd. Unlike the change of the definition of disability, which is true for both ballots and for absentee registration, if you have a fear of COVID, that's a sufficient reason to apply to register absentee, just as that's a sufficient reason to vote absentee. That definition is good. They've been very clear. That is going to be in effect all the way through November. So that is a valid reason, and that's all you have to do to get vote absentee, and that's all you have to do in terms of a reason to request an absentee registration. The difficulties, and I'm going to read you off some of the things that they put in place, what they've said, these are only in effect till June 2nd. We're going to re-examine the process of absentee registration as we go forward. I'm not sure what they think is going to change, and I don't think anything is going to change, but they haven't guaranteed this through November yet. So one of the things they said that, if you don't have a copy machine at home, how do you send in the copies of your documents? They're allowing people to take pictures on their cell phones or any sort of digital way they can get a picture of the documents and email in the pictures of the documents. They've requested that supervisors hold multiple meetings. They usually meet in June and then again in September. They've requested that supervisors hold multiple meetings to register people. The applications have to either be delivered in person or mailed in. What they've made a suggestion to make this a little bit easier is that there be a drop-off box at the clerk's office, that somebody has to be there from the clerk's office, because they can then call it an in-person thing, and they're suggesting that people could drop off the applications in a drop-off box if it's staffed by somebody from the clerk's office. If the applications have to be witnessed, they don't have to be notarized. There's an affidavit within them that you swear that the stuff you're saying is true, and it has to be witnessed under the current law. What they've suggested is if you can't get somebody to witness the affidavit, the clerks and the supervisors are urged by the Secretary of State to make an accommodation. And there's a couple of accommodations they've suggested. The first is that they allow for in-person drive-up registrations where somebody just comes up and slips it through the window of the car and signs it for them, and then that's considered in person, and the official is the witness to the signature. They've told the towns that if people can't get pictures of the documents or can't drive there, that they should drive to the people where possible and see if somebody can come out of their house and do that. They've said to the local officials that if they can't do that, if they have their own fears about doing that, that they can contact the Secretary of State's office and they will attempt to find somebody to do that for them. So they are taking some real serious steps to make it possible for people to register. There's a whole bunch of safety measures in this frequently asked questions. It was sent out last week to the local officials, but it wasn't posted online anywhere. And it apparently the people on the committee, one of them told me they hadn't even heard about it as of yesterday. So I sent it to them, so they have it. But so I think at some point we're going to try to get this document up on the Democratic Party website, which I've got to put a plug in for Kelsey Klemenowitz, who's put it together. I've been doing this stuff for a long time, and I have never seen as good a interface for voters to get information about elections on a party or campaign website. So I urge people to go look at that, and she updates it all the time. So it's just a fantastic tool.
Paul, for those of us, for those on the call, can we distribute that if they want it? If somebody on this
Sure.
call wants to send an email to Olivia, then we can
Sure.
distribute that document. out.
I'll get it to Olivia after the.
Yeah, I have it. So as long as you're
Oh,
as long as it's okay to distribute it, then yes, we'll give it out.
Yeah, I can't think of any reason you couldn't distribute it. It's a public document.
Yeah, or you can just put it in the chat that you want it. So.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I think you'll be impressed with a lot of the things they're doing. You know, they say things like, just because somebody doesn't have access to a photocopier, they don't lose their right to vote. You can't deny the right to register to vote because the applicant doesn't have access to resources. And that's great language, and really, you know, it puts a burden on the local officials, but that's really where it has to be in this situation, because the voters have an absolute right to vote.
Yeah. Thank you. So we have had a lot of conversations around the dinner table in our house about voting, and some of the things that have come up, questions that we have are applications going to be made easily accessible for voting? Will they be available, say, in public places or online, so that people can get them easily, or do they have to directly contact the clerk's office to get them?
Well, there's two ways in the statute to get them. One is the clerk's office, and the other is the Secretary of State's office. The statute requires the Secretary of State to send them out to anyone. I know that the committee advisory committee of the Secretary of State's office is looking at this question, and I know that some of the members of it have suggested that they be put all over town, the applications to register, in supermarkets, at police stations, fire stations, wherever, so that people can easily, get them. I think that will happen, but again, the more they hear from people that it needs to happen, the more likely it is to happen.
Okay. And in terms of processing the applications, I know a lot of the clerk's offices are closed. Is there staff available right now to process these applications?
Short answer is probably no, but it depends on where you are. Right now, a lot of applications aren't coming in. Normally, probably 98% of all registrations take place in the 3 weeks leading up to an election. If that's what happens this year, we'll have a nightmare because they won't be able to deal with it. But that's why they're being encouraged to have more meetings and process them through over the summer. And that's why we want to get people registered as early as we can so that they're able to deal with it. But it's going to be a difficult thing. There's some talk of getting some extra resources for the supervisors. Ultimately, they're the ones who have to vote on the registrations, but the clerks could get some help. There's actually some talk of the National Guard helping out at different points in the process. If anybody, we've talked about voter protection volunteers, asking them to volunteer to help their clerks and registers and doing things like that. And if anybody has access to groups, I know a Rotary, the clerk of Keene told me today that the Rotary Club is going to help out and try to get people to volunteer to help out on election day. So there's all sorts of opportunity just to help your local people.
Well, I saw that Louise Spencer joined the call. So Louise has access to a group of activists and you might want to help out. So,
and there's another sort of interrelated issue there as well. People, there's a lot of concern about not the registration process, but the process of processing the absentee ballots when they arrive. And I think one of the things that the committee is looking at, and one thing that the legislature may look at, is allowing clerks to not necessarily open the envelopes and take out absentee ballots before the election, but in the days in the lead up before the election to process the absentee ballots so that they can be compared to the checklist and go through that process in the day or the days before the election so that come election day, when it comes time to actually count the absentee ballots, that work's all already been done. And there's I know the committee is considering that and how that would be done to conform with public meeting laws and observation and all of that as well.
Yeah, as someone who has observed in the polls for many years the process of counting the absentee ballots, and one of the issues that I heard that the committee had heard about is how the folded absentee ballots jam up the machines, right? I mean, it's something as simple as that could really slow things down on election day. And so my understanding is that there may actually even be an attempt to address that. Is that right, Paul? Have you heard about that?
They've talked about larger envelopes so that people don't fold them. Ultimately, the slowing up of the machines doesn't concern me really a whole lot because that's really just a counting process.
Right.
It's really getting people to vote that you don't
Right.
want to blow up.
Right.
Yeah, I think we'd all do it good if we could hold our breath for a few minutes on election night and not need to know the results at 8:01. But
right. So I have a whole list of things, and I just wanted to touch briefly on in-person voting before we switch over to questions. But there are a lot of questions in the chat and that have been sent in, so we want to get to those. But there are a lot of safety issues that people are concerned about on the day of voting. Making sure that the staff is safe, that there's social distancing, whether there's room in the polling place to allow for social distancing, whether voting booths, how voting booths are going to be sanitized between voters, how pencils will be sanitized, sort of just a whole host of issues. But so before we move on to questions, do either of you want to comment at all on in-person voting and the safety issues?
Well, there's significant issues. I think one saving grace is I don't think you're going to have a huge turnout on election day. I could be wrong, and the situation obviously could change a whole lot. But from what I can see right now, I would anticipate the in-person voting to be maybe 20% of what it usually is, which would help a lot in terms of having space. But many of our polling places are really tight and cramped.
Yeah.
So I mean those are real problems. There's all sorts of safety concerns that are going to need to be addressed, and some of it can be addressed by the Secretary of State and the Attorney Generals, and explaining what the powers of the moderator are to control voting sites. But again, this would be somewhat helpful if the legislature could take some actions to put some things into statutes to make it very clear that if a moderator feels that everybody has to wear a mask if they want to vote in person, then the moderator has that authority.
And those issues about the safety issues, I know that is something that the Secretary of State's Commission is looking at. There was a proposal submitted to them to lay out, mechanisms similar to, I think what we're used to seeing when we go through a checkout line at the supermarket now with, plastic shields and PPE for poll workers, or masks and gloves for voters. Again, the commission's only going to be able to make recommendations. It's not going to have the force of law. But hopefully some of those recommendations will either be picked up as an executive order, or, when the legislature meets next month, some of those recommendations hopefully will be considered by the legislature as well.
And in all of these polling places, we are also used to, those of us who've stood at the polls outside holding signs for many years, the polling places are set up and everybody knows where they stand, and the voters walk by, and even something like that's going to have to be rethought, repositioning the people who are standing outside the polls so that they are socially distanced from each other and also from the voters. Right? All right, at this point, I think because we know we have a lot of questions, and it's 6:11 now, we have 20 minutes left, so let's open it up for questions, Olivia.
Awesome. Okay, so lots of questions. We're going to try to get to as many as possible. Probably won't get to all of them, but hopefully we'll be able to put together some follow-up material to address a lot of these questions. So in terms of in-person voting, a lot of people are asking about what we were just talking about. How do we ensure the safety of poll workers and poll goers? There's been a lot of questions about, do we think the state is going to have some guidelines or requirements for the way that polling locations are set up? Or is this going to be something that each town is going to have to determine? Does the town moderator have the authority to require workers and poll goers, for example, to wear masks? So a lot of people are asking about that, and if there could be any potential legal difficulties with making a requirement like that. A lot of people are asking that question.
My opinion in this will play out, and we'll see what the state does. It would first of all be much preferable to have clear guidance from the Attorney General's office and Secretary of State's office, and if not that, in statute for the authority to control what goes on at the polling place. My opinion is the moderators already have that authority and all the authority they need. But I think the problem is voters need to know how it's going to be exercised before they go there, because they have to make a decision of whether it's safe to go there. So that we really do need to have a statewide standards and an understanding by everybody just what the polling place is going to be like and how safe it's going to be.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think that if people are confident that the polling place is safe, then I think it's more likely people will vote on election day as well, or the people that need to vote on election day will vote on election day as well. And so hopefully, that guidance is coming from both the Attorney General and the Secretary of State.
There'll have to be, I guess, some way that the voter shows their ID to the the checklist worker, from 6 feet away, I guess. And, has we thought at all about poll watchers and whether they're going to be in the polls this year, or where they're going to be located, or how that would work?
We haven't made any determinations on that. I mean, I guarantee you there'll be poll watchers there, but
Yeah.
exactly how they'll be or what they'll do, I don't know.
Another,
Olivia,
Yeah.
a mask though. Could you guys address masks? I know there was a question about whether people could be asked to pull their mask down in order to identify themselves, or can they be ordered to wear a mask? And we're hearing a lot of that. So.
I've got to say the whole ID thing at the polls is really stupid, because anybody can just sign a qualified voter affidavit anyway, and you don't actually need the ID. I would like to see the legislature get rid of the voter ID requirement at the polls this year. I mean, it does absolutely nothing. It doesn't stop a single person from voting. All it does is take time up of the process, and then in this situation, it creates a nightmare. Ultimately, moderators and the election officials have to follow the law as it's written. And they may ask somebody at times to pull the mask down, but that's something we should get guidance on from the state of when they do it, what the situation is. Is there 6 feet or more distance when they're asked to do that? Those are all things that the state should, it's going to have to determine. Bill, do you have any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because the way the law is written is if you have your ID on your person, you need to show it. So in order to exempt people from that process and just allow people to sign the affidavits certifying who they are, there would need to be a change in the law. That being said, exposing voters and poll workers all day long to people, to getting close to people to satisfy the ID law, which, as Paul says, accomplishes absolutely nothing in this state except slowing down the line to begin with. That's the real purpose of the law. That in these types of circumstances, it will only slow down the line more. So hopefully there'll be some relief from that process for these elections.
Yeah, just one other thing about the affidavits. After I said that, I realized that, every time you sign an affidavit, you're handing a pen back and forth and a piece of paper back and forth, and that has its own danger, which is probably a greater danger than pulling the mask down. So the whole thing, I don't see a good way around this other than getting rid of the stupid ID law.
And we'll still have that problem at the same day registration desk, right? The documents going back and forth.
Right. Nothing terrifies the local officials more than the same day registration, because that is a lot of interaction. They spend probably on average 4 or 5 minutes in close proximity with a voter, touching the same documents, looking at the same documents, pointing things out, handing pens back and forth. And that is a terrifying thought for the local officials. They came to the committee last week and just begged them to make it easier for people to register by mail, because they just don't want to be doing that.
Okay, Olivia.
Another question that a couple of folks, thank you, Betty Lasky and Joan Jacobs, have brought up, the question of, has the commission discussed drop-off boxes for absentee ballots, maybe at town halls, especially for after hours, or at libraries? Is that something that we think might be an option for voters to drop off their absentee ballots?
They have discussed it, and I was somewhat surprised how receptive some of the members of the committee were to that, at least at town hall, that if people wanted to just drop off the absentee ballot request at town hall, or the absentee ballot at town hall before election day, I think that is one thing that's under consideration. There are some proponents of this concept that would like to expand that beyond town hall, especially in some communities where it may be difficult to get to town hall. Manchester springs to mind, maybe Nashua. But again, that is under discussion. Whether that will be a final recommendation obviously remains to be seen.
Great, thank you. A question from Paul Birch. He says a question he gets all the time. Given that absentee ballots, for everyone are allowed, under this disability provision for COVID, what would be the effect if Governor Sununu decided on August 1st or October 1st that the COVID emergency no longer exists? Is that something that could potentially happen and change the landscape here?
When they were first talking about this, and when we knew the governor was going to come out with an emergency declaration, I was very concerned about that, whether it was going to be a bait and switch. The language that everybody has used since has been that the change in definition or the interpretation of the definition of disability will be in place through November, no matter what the state of the epidemic is. And I'll take a second, I can find that language in a second, but I don't think the language could be clearer. They would really have to, I don't know how they could go back on that at this point. I think they've fully committed to saying that fear of COVID is going to be a valid reason to get an absentee ballot and to register absentee.
Awesome, thank you so much. So I recognize Representative Nordgren, thank you. I know you've been waiting patiently to ask a question. I'm gonna unmute you and please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Good. This is a good virtual meeting. Thank you very much. It's only my third of the day, which is and then going to Concord every day. I'm up here at Dartmouth, and we're really concerned about the issue of student voting. Kelsey at the state party is doing a wonderful job, and we're glad she has that position. And Riley Gordon, Dartmouth student, is working with her. I think right now everyone's thinking, let's not rock the boat until the Secretary of State's committee has some final recommendations. And obviously we have to always remember that these are recommendations, just like all the gopher money and the money that's coming from CARES. These are recommendations to the governor, so who knows what he's really going to do. He hasn't taken the gopher recommendations the way they submitted, so it's hard to know what could happen. Obviously with Maggie only winning her Senate seat by over 1,000 votes, we're really concerned about how the students can vote. Could they say that they have reasonable concern for trying to get an absentee ballot? But then the other issue is if they're not here and they're not on campus and they might not have a Inman mailbox, things are going to get really complicated. And I think that's something we need to really worry about. And I think obviously other people are worrying about it. The other issue is when we're talking about something like not having to have the voter present ID at the polls, isn't the governor able to issue some executive orders to clarify some of those concerns? I mean, he's given all kinds of other executive orders. Why couldn't he give an executive order that just covers this September and this November to clarify and maybe take away some of the concern and risk, so the legislature doesn't have to act and he doesn't have to deal with a bill? I mean, I think that'd be a really difficult process.
He clearly could do a lot of things. I don't want to say he could do anything in the world he wanted to because there's constitutional rights involved, but the governor could make this process work a whole lot quicker and under his emergency powers. I will point out that he's not the only one in the state that has emergency powers. The legislature has the same power he has to declare an emergency and can do so anytime they want. So.
Well, maybe we'll have to discuss that, Paul.
I do think that one of several good things that have come out from the executive, the guidance letters and the orders that have come out as well is that for the students, for instance, the Dartmouth students who are currently registered to vote in this state, that, as long as they maintain New Hampshire as their domicile, those students should be able to vote absentee in the fall elections. And so there may be a logistical issue about how they get their absentee ballots, and they may need to be educated on that. And that may be something that the party or the Dartmouth Dems or what have you need to put in a logistical plan in place for that. And things like that are in the works, I can tell everybody. But the fact that they are registered means under this process, if they're concerned about COVID, that they should be able to vote absentee in most circumstances.
And what about the 1264? I thought there was another court decision yesterday that's sending it around again, or?
Yeah, there was a decision that came out yesterday that, to oversimplify it a little bit, said that if you are domiciled in New Hampshire, you are a resident of New Hampshire. And so what the result of that, the main part of the decision means is if you register to vote in New Hampshire and you drive in New Hampshire, you have to get a New Hampshire driver's license. There's some sort of permutations about that we're looking at. But I think that, in attempting to adopt that scheme, the Republicans, when they controlled the legislature, what they may have ended up with a process that all college students in this state should be voting in this state because some of the results of that decision. But more guidance from that will come as well.
Okay, thank you.
So maybe we have time for maybe another question or two. This is a really simple question, but one that I've heard from several people, is when folks are applying for their absentee ballots, do they have to apply separately for the primary and the general elections, or can they use one application to apply for both of those elections?
They can use one application. The application has let you apply for either one or both.
Marvelous, that's great. Okay, so maybe we might be able to take a couple more then, that's great. One question from Joan Hamlet, thank you. She's asking, what is the difference between absentee voting and voting by mail? Obviously, every state is kind of approaching this differently, and some states are using the term voting by mail. What is the difference between those, especially as we see it happening in New Hampshire?
Well, normally in New Hampshire, there's a difference because absentee voting, you have to have a certain condition that qualifies you for it. Whereas if you states that say voting by mail, everybody can vote by mail, whether or not they qualify or have some qualifying. Given that the state has said that everybody in the state has a valid reason to apply for an absentee ballot because of the COVID fears, there really is no difference. I mean, it's just words at this point. They're the same. For this election alone, they're the same thing as in New Hampshire because everybody can vote by mail by getting an absentee ballot.
And Paul, I have a question. How long in advance of the election is the absentee ballot available? Or the ballot, I guess.
Well, we have the latest primary in the country. And there isn't a whole lot of time between the primary and the election. It's basically 2 months. And it takes about a month to get them printed. They have to print the overseas ballots first because they have to go out, I think it's 45 days before the election. So they get those done first, and then they start doing the absentee and regular ballots. So the answer is roughly, there's a date in the statute that they have to have them to the clerks by. I think it's 30 days before the election.
I think it's October 3rd.
Is it? Yeah, so that's roughly 30, right?
Yeah.
So that's basically it. I mean, they're not even going to exist till that time. So that's about when you can get them.
How about for the primary?
It's the same sort of thing, just backing it back from the primary date. So probably 30
so
days.
like August 8th or something like that.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Olivia, any more questions?
Yeah, I think a nice question to wrap this up. Thank you, Natalia Strong, for this question from Facebook. how are we going to get all of this good information out to all the voters who need to know this? What are your thoughts on, and what are some of the next steps, especially for folks who are listening to this call who probably want to spread the word as well as we can and try to get answers to some of these questions from the state? What do you recommend that we do next?
More people should go to Cinde Warmington campaign events, and they'll get the information. But in addition to that, I do think that the New Hampshire Democratic Party will be publicizing these issues on its website and in email blasts and other statements. I think, some of the, and also in statements to the press. And so, as Paul mentioned earlier, I think I mentioned it too, so far, check out the guidance page on the party's website. It is really well done. The people who worked on that deserve a lot of credit. There'll be more of that down the line. So there will be a systemic effort to do that. But I also think that, will be an obligation on all of us to spread the word as well, as well as other organizations who are sympathetic to our cause.
Yeah, I would just say that every single campaign has an interest in making sure that this happens, and the efforts to coordinate the campaigns around that will be helpful. Paul, I think you're going to be involved in this from a perspective of a campaign as well, right?
Yeah. Aside from the campaigns in the party, and my short answer was going to be that's Ray Buckley's job. Tell him to do it. But really, we can't rely on the campaigns in the party. Every one of us and all of the citizens have to get up there. And if you belong to a church or Rotary, Future Farmers Club, you have to spread the word among the contacts you have in the community in every way you can, because democracy is just too important, and this is everything's on the line here. So,
any closing remarks, Paul?
No, I wanted to thank you for letting me talk to everybody. There's so many wonderful friends on this conversation who ask two hard questions, but I still like them. And thank you for being a strong voice for voting rights. I appreciate that, everything you do.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us. Bill, any closing remarks?
Yeah, I think the task is, in some ways the task ahead's daunting as far as organizing all of this and making sure the word gets out. But, we all put a lot of resources into getting out the vote on election day and the lead up to election day. This is just going to be a longer, more sustained process. And we're going to need to be encouraging people to be doing this in the days or weeks before the election. But, I do think with the changes in the rules that allow more and more people to vote absentee, with the interest in this election, we're going to have to push it. But I do think we can get the word out, and we'll hopefully get that turnout that we need in order to win this election.
Thanks. So we are always respectful of people's times and try to stop right on time, and we're 2 minutes over, so we'll wrap this up. But we can stay on the line for a few extra minutes after.
I think Senator Lasky wants to say something.
Yeah, if anyone has an important question, please. We are officially adjourned, but if anyone wants to stay and ask, we'll stay on for a little bit and answer questions.
Sure. Let me, Senator Lasky, let me just find you and unmute you, and we would love to hear from you. Thanks for your patience. All right.
Have there been discussions about nursing homes and assisted living? Because they're, to me, we've always made a concerted effort to get their votes, but now, I'd be afraid to go into one of those places, and they don't want you there. So what is going to be, to me, that's going to involve a whole new process.
So I know, for instance, from the last election, that I think it's Dover has at least one, maybe two polling places that are actually in a nursing home or an assisted living facility. And there's concerns there about not only the people that live there, but inviting, people from the community in there to vote on election day. And so there's been some questions raised on that issue, and should some polling places be moved on election day because of that issue. Hopefully, people who are living in an assisted living facilities or nursing homes, the word will get, it seems to me that all of those individuals under the Secretary of State's guidance about COVID-19 should be able to vote absentee.
There are provisions in the statutes that allow the nursing home administrators to help out in ways that nobody else can help voters in terms of doing the paperwork. And I think a lot of that's going to have to be done through the administration of the nursing homes. By the way, I talked to the Dover clerk the other day, and they are actively looking for new polling places. So I don't think they'll be doing the voting in the nursing homes.
Right.
But that's a real problem. I mean, you're not going to get a lot of people to go in there. So the state's going to have to figure out a way, because those people have the same right everybody else has to vote. We've got to figure out a way to do it.
That raises another concern that I've heard quite a lot about, and that is whether you will actually find the number of volunteers to be willing to come to the polls and work the polls as they have historically, as many of them are in the vulnerable population susceptible to this virus.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, the Keene clerk told me just a couple hours ago that her average age of a poll worker is 66 or 67. And, they're looking now, going out in the community and trying to find a younger group of people. But it's hard to get poll workers, adequate staff in most places. I mean, it's not hard in, kind of well-to-do communities, but it's not hard in small towns, but in cities, it's just a nightmare getting enough people in Manchester, just all the way up the Merrimack River. It's always hard to do. And it's going to be 10 times harder. And that's why a lot of people who care about democracy are going to have to step up and fill the void here.
yeah. All right. Are we all set, Olivia?
I think maybe Representative Nordgren, did you want to ask one more quick question? Just taking you. All right.
Thank you. So I put on the little chat, the Committee to Elect House Democrats is going to have an event with Eric Holder later in June, and he's going to talk about redistricting. Obviously, that's the reason we need to get a majority in the House and Senate this year, because of redistricting. So Eric has a nonprofit that he's running, and he's going to come and talk about redistricting and the importance of electing House and Senate Democrats.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you
For
sharing.
reminding us. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you all. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Bill. This is very informative to me, and really appreciate everybody coming tonight. And we'll see you at another event soon. Take
Thank
care.
you all.
Thank you.
Take care.
I'll see you in a few minutes.